When you think about a revolution or something that fundamentally changes the course of human history, you usually picture an army.
Oh, absolutely, or at least massive resources.
Yeah, exactly. You picture political backing or maybe this violent, coordinated overthrow. You definitely don't usually picture two guys covered in bruises just, walking down a dirt road.
No, you really don't.
But today, that's exactly what we're looking at. Two battered men on an ancient highway. We are taking a deep dive into a really fascinating historical account from the book of Acts, specifically chapter 17, and to really decode how these two individuals managed to spark a movement that their enemies literally claimed turned the world upside down. We've brought in some heavy-hitting historical and biblical commentaries.
Right, we're looking at the Moody Bible commentary, the ESV Study Bible, and the Expositor's Bible commentary to get a really rounded view of this text.
Exactly. We're gathering the takeaways from all these sources impartially, just to see what the original text is actually doing.
Because it is an incredibly rich piece of historical text. What we are really examining today is, well, it's a masterclass in disruption. We are tracing how a single radical message carried by just a few traveling messengers entered the ancient Roman Empire and sent shockwaves through its established social, religious, and political systems.
And what we want to focus on is the human reaction to that disruption, because when paradigm-shifting information hits a community, people react in wildly different ways.
Okay, let's unpack this. Just picture the scene for a second. The two men are Paul and Silas.
Right.
They've just been beaten.
Yeah.
Badly, and thrown in a dark subterranean prison in a city called Philippi. They miraculously get out, but instead of going home to recover, they decide to walk 100 miles down a Roman road to deliver a message that is going to completely upend the social order.
And that 100-mile journey, it requires some serious context, because they are traveling along the Via Egnatia?
The Via Egnatia. Yeah, it was the main east-west Roman highway. Think of it as the major interstate of the ancient world. It was paved with these massive stone blocks, heavily trafficked by merchants, soldiers, imperial messengers. It was busy.
So they aren't just taking back roads.
No, not at all. And our sources indicate they actually pass right through two other fairly significant cities on this road, Amphipolis and Apollonia. But they don't stop to preach there. They just keep walking, despite their injuries.
I'm curious about that. I mean, if your goal is to spread a message as far and wide as possible, why walk right past two perfectly good cities?
Well, the historical consensus from the commentaries is that they bypassed those towns because neither had a Jewish synagogue.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and for Paul, the synagogue was the essential entry point. He had a specific operational strategy. The texts actually refer to it as his custom. He always went to the Jews first.
Yeah.
The synagogue gave him this prepared audience of people who already knew the Hebrew scriptures, the prophecies, and the foundational worldview he was about to challenge.
So they needed that shared baseline of knowledge to even begin the conversation.
Exactly.
So they push on for 100 miles until they hit Thessalonica. And Thessalonica is not just another dot on the map, is it?
Oh, definitely not. Thessalonica was a massive, free commercial city. We're talking about a thriving metropolis with a population that could have been up to maybe 200,000 people.
Wow, that's huge for the ancient world.
It really is. It was founded back in 315 BC by a man named Cassander, who named the city after his wife, who just happened to be the half-sister of Alexander the Great.
That is quite the pedigree.
Right. And by the time Paul and Silas, limp into town, it's the capital of the Roman province of Macedonia. It connects their rich agricultural interior with massive land and sea trade routes.
I look at Paul's approach here, and honestly, it reminds me of a modern-day strategic startup rollout.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Yeah, like he isn't just wandering randomly from village to village hoping someone will listen. He's specifically targeting a major cultural and commercial incubator.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. Thessalonica had incredible network effects.
Right.
Because if you drop a disruptive idea into a rural village, it stays in the village. But if you establish a node in Thessalonica, the merchants, the sailors, the travelers, they literally take that idea and distribute it across the entire empire for you. Paul understood the mechanics of information distribution.
So he gets into this major hub, he goes to the synagogue, and for 3 Sabbaths, he reasons with them from the scriptures. But he isn't just giving a standard feel-good sermon.
No, not at all.
The commentaries point out that the message he was delivering was a massive theological stumbling block. I mean, he was using their own Old Testament text to prove that the long-awaited Messiah actually had to suffer, die, and rise from the dead.
Which was completely counterintuitive to the expectations of the time.
How so?
Well, the prevailing Jewish anticipation was for a conquering political king. They were looking for someone who would, ride in on a war horse, crush the Roman occupation, and restore Israel's geopolitical sovereignty.
Right, they wanted a military victory.
Exactly. So when Paul says, hey, the Messiah you were waiting for was actually the guy who just got crucified by the Romans like a common criminal, that is a deeply offensive paradox to his audience. He is taking their most sacred texts and completely re-engineering how they are supposed to be understood.
But despite how offensive or backwards that might have sounded to them, the strategy actually works. The message catches fire. And the demographics of who buys into this are really fascinating.
They are.
Because the commentaries note that some Jews believed, but a massive number of God-fearing Greeks joined them. Wait, let me pause you there.
Yeah.
What exactly does the text mean by God-fearing Greeks in a first-century Roman context?
So God-fearers was a specific technical term. It referred to Gentiles non-Jews who were deeply attracted to the monotheism and the high moral ethics of Judaism.
Okay.
They attended the synagogue, they worshiped the God of Israel, but they hadn't taken the final heavy steps of full conversion, like undergoing circumcision or keeping the strict dietary laws.
So they were kind of on the fringe.
Right, they were on the periphery. Paul's message essentially told them, through Jesus, you have full, unrestricted access to God without having to become culturally Jewish first. It was a message of profound inclusion, and they've responded to it in droves.
That makes a lot of sense. And the sources also highlight that a large number of prominent women were persuaded.
Yes, that's a key detail.
Why would a disruptive message about a crucified Messiah specifically appeal to high-status Greco-Roman women?
To understand that, you have to look at the sociological landscape of the ancient world. Even wealthy, prominent women in Greco-Roman society operated under pretty significant constraints. Their status was almost entirely tied to their husbands or fathers.
Right.
The early Christian movement, however, offered a radical new social structure. It promoted spiritual equality, it valued women as vital co-laborers in the faith, and it held men to a strict standard of marital fidelity.
Which was definitely not the norm in broader pagan culture.
Exactly. So for a prominent woman, perhaps the wife of a leading city official, this new community offered a level of dignity and agency that the traditional Roman pantheon simply did not provide.
And it's important to note that Paul wasn't just there for a quick 3-week seminar. The commentaries point out, based on his later letters, that he actually stayed in Thessalonica for quite a while.
Yes, longer than just those initial 3 Sabbaths.
Long enough to work a manual labor job to support himself, and long enough to receive multiple financial aid shipments from the church back in Philippi. He is building a robust, fully functioning alternative community right under the noses of the established religious leaders.
He really is. He is organizing a new society, largely made up of former pagans and God-fearers.
So Paul is basically siphoning off the wealthy, influential people, the prominent women, and these large crowds from the traditional synagogue.
Yeah.
That isn't just a theological annoyance for the established leaders. That's a direct threat to their survival, their status, and their influence, which brings up an intense reaction. The local Jewish leaders see their power slipping away, and they become fiercely jealous. But here's where it gets really interesting to me. It seems crazy that highly educated religious scholars would stoop to hiring street thugs.
It does seem out of character on the surface.
The text literally says they gathered lewd fellows of the baser sort, basically evil men from the marketplace, to start a citywide riot. Was that a common political tactic back then, or were they just uniquely desperate?
What's fascinating here is that it reveals a timeless truth about human power dynamics. When entrenched power structures are genuinely threatened, the response rarely stays intellectual.
Right.
The religious leaders couldn't win the argument on the merits. Paul was using logical, scriptural reasoning, and the people were being persuaded. When you can't win the debate, you change the battlefield.
Wow.
Going to the agora, the marketplace, and hiring idle thugs to incite a riot wasn't just desperation. It was a calculated weaponization of the local population. They needed chaos to force the hands of the authorities.
So they literally organize a mob, and this mob swarms the house of a man named Jason.
Yes, Jason.
Jason is a prominent new convert who had been hosting Paul and Silas. I mean, just imagine opening your door to find a screaming mob demanding you hand over your house guests. Talk about the worst Airbnb guests ever.
It's a terrifying scenario.
Yeah.
The mob wants to drag Paul and Silas out into the street, presumably to face vigilante justice, but Paul and Silas aren't there.
The mob can't find their primary targets. But instead of just throwing their hands up and going home, they pivot. The whole situation shifts from a violent street brawl to a highly calculated legal trap.
Very calculated.
They drag Jason and some of the other new believers before the city magistrates. And the sources say these officials in Thessalonica were called politarchs.
Yes, and the charges they level against Jason and the Christians are just a masterclass in political manipulation. They stand in front of the politarchs and shout, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here too."
Which, by the way, is massive hyperbole for a movement that is only a few years old at this point.
True.
But historically speaking, it turned out to be incredibly prophetic.
Exactly. But the core legal charge is what makes this so dangerous. They claim that Jason is harboring men who are acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar.
Because they're saying there is another King Jesus.
Right.
I have to admit, I'm a bit confused here. Rome had thousands of gods. They conquered nations and just absorbed their deities into the pantheon. Why would the city council care at all if Paul was preaching about Jesus? Why not just ignore it as a minor religious dispute?
Because the religious leaders didn't frame it as a religious dispute.
Oh.
They knew the politarchs didn't care about Jewish theology. Rome's rule for local religion was incredibly simple. Keep it quiet, don't cause unrest, and pay your taxes.
Ah, okay.
So the opponents brilliantly framed Paul's message as civil treason. To claim there is another king implies sedition against the emperor. And in the Roman Empire, sedition is a capital offense.
That is just manipulative genius. So they are translating a spiritual message into a political insurrection just to trigger the Roman legal system.
Precisely. And you have to consider the broader political climate at the time. The commentaries highlight that Emperor Claudius had recently issued edicts expelling Jews from Rome, specifically because of civil unrest.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So the politarchs in Thessalonica would have been acutely aware of this. They would be absolutely terrified that a riot in their streets over a new king would invite a brutal Roman military crackdown on their free city.
Put yourself in Jason's shoes for a second. You invite 2 traveling teachers in for dinner, and a week later, a mob is trying to burn your house down, and the city council is treating you as an accomplice to imperial treason.
It escalated so fast.
You could lose everything, literally everything.
Right, and the politarchs are clearly agitated,
Yeah.
but they take a surprisingly bureaucratic route to defuse the bomb. Since they don't have Paul, the main instigator, they force Jason to post a security. This is essentially a heavy bail bond.
Meaning, they tell Jason, give us a massive sum of money, and if Paul causes any more trouble in our city, you lose your life savings, and you probably lose your freedom.
Yes. It was a very clever legal maneuver that effectively exiled Paul without the politarchs having to execute anyone.
Wow.
Jason's property and his very life were now the collateral guaranteeing Paul's actions. In fact, Paul later refers to this exact legal blockade in one of his letters, calling it Satan's hindrance, because it legally bound his hands from ever returning to the Thessalonian believers. He couldn't go back without endangering Jason's life.
So this highly successful strategic mission in a major hub is just completely shut down, not because the message failed, but because of this corrupt fusion of jealousy, mob violence, and legal extortion.
Exactly.
Under the cover of darkness, Paul and Silas are forced to flee the city. But as they slip away from this deeply toxic environment, they stumble into an audience that operates in the exact opposite way.
Yes, they do. The local believers send Paul and Silas about 50 miles southwest to a city called Berea. Now, historically and geographically speaking, Berea is a massive step down from Thessalonica.
Yeah.
It's tucked away in the foothills, entirely off the main Via Egnatia highway. It is not a bustling cosmopolitan trade hub.
But true to his startup strategy, Paul doesn't change his core method just because he got burned. He goes straight into the Berean synagogue and presents the exact same disruptive message.
Right.
But the reception here is staggering. The texts use a very specific Greek word to describe the people of Berea, Eugenes.
Eugenes, yes. Originally, that word meant of noble birth, referring to aristocracy. But in this context, Luke, the author of Acts, uses it to describe their character. It means they were noble-minded, they were fair, objective, and intellectually honest.
To put it in modern terms, the Bereans were like the ultimate open-source intelligence analysts. They were dedicated fact-checkers.
I love that comparison.
Yeah, I mean, when Paul walked in and made these massive world-altering claims about a resurrected Messiah, they didn't just blindly accept it because he was a persuasive speaker. But crucially, they didn't violently reject it and hire a mob because it threatened their traditions.
They listened.
The text says they received the word with all readiness. They were genuinely eager to hear new information. But then they searched the scriptures daily to verify if the facts held up.
And to connect this to the bigger picture, that daily search is profound. It establishes something incredibly important for the history of religious thought. The idea that ordinary people have the capacity to evaluate truth for themselves.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, the commentaries refer to this as establishing the doctrine of the clarity of Scripture. That might sound like heavy theological jargon, but practically, it just means that you don't need an elite scholar or some religious hierarchy to tell you what to think.
Right.
The text is clear enough that the average person can read it, weigh the evidence, and understand it. The Bereans judged Paul's revolutionary message not by their cultural biases and not by political fear, but by the objective standard of the written texts they possessed.
They refused to outsource their thinking to a crowd. They did the hard work themselves, and because of that objective daily evaluation, the text says many of them believed.
Yes, and once again, it wasn't just marginalized people.
Right. It included prominent Greek men and women who weighed the evidence and made a rational, informed decision. It is such a breath of fresh air after the frantic chaos of Thessalonica.
It truly is a moment of intellectual peace, but unfortunately, it couldn't last. The success Paul was having in Berea just couldn't be kept quiet.
Because word travels fast. The leaders back in Thessalonica hear that Paul is at it again. And they don't just say, well, good riddance, at least he's not disrupting our city anymore.
No, they don't.
They actually leave their homes and travel the 50 miles to Berea just to shut him down.
And we have to remember, 50 miles on foot in the ancient world is not a casual afternoon drive. That is a grueling multi-day journey fueled entirely by animosity.
So what does this all mean?
Well, when they arrive, they use their exact same playbook.
Right.
They don't walk into the Berean synagogue to engage in scriptural debate. They immediately bypass the intellect and go straight to the emotions, stirring up and agitating the crowds.
That is just, it's the ancient equivalent of creating fake burner accounts just to continue arguing with someone who already blocked you on social media.
That's hilarious, but it's true.
It's pure, unadulterated hater energy. I mean, what does it say about human nature that these opponents would spend days walking down a dirt road just to silence a conversation happening in a completely different city?
It highlights the terrifying perceived threat of this new movement. For the Thessalonian leaders, this wasn't merely a disagreement over the interpretation of the prophet Isaiah, it was an existential crisis.
Because if he's right,
If Paul's message was true, their entire worldview, their social standing, and their institutional authority were rendered completely obsolete. They couldn't allow that idea to exist anywhere, even 50 miles away. Their reaction is pure ideological contagion control. They wanted to kill the virus before it spread back to them.
and the Bereans see this happening, they see the mob forming, and they realize that the Thessalonian Jews likely have the ear of the broader provincial Roman authorities. They know Paul is the primary target. He's the main spokesman, the face of the movement, so they have to act incredibly fast.
They do. They immediately secure Paul and escort him away, taking him to the sea and eventually bringing him all the way down to Athens. Athens, of course, being the absolute intellectual and philosophical center of the ancient Greek world.
It's like a high-stakes game of ancient chess. Paul, the king piece, is moved off the board to Athens to stay safe, but he leaves his key allies, Silas and Timothy, behind in Berea temporarily.
Yes, the logistics of this retreat are intricate, and the commentaries really map out the ensuing redeployment well. Silas and Timothy weren't the primary targets of the mob's rage, so they could safely stay behind to help establish and strengthen this new church of fact-checkers in Berea.
Right.
Once Paul is safely in Athens, he sends a command back with his escorts, telling Silas and Timothy to join him with all speed. Later on, we actually learn from the epistles that Paul gets so worried about the young persecuted church back in Thessalonica, the one he had to abandon because of Jason's bail bond, that he actually sends Timothy back into the danger zone to check on them.
Wow, that's incredibly brave.
It is. Silas goes elsewhere in Macedonia, likely back to Philippi, and eventually they all reunite with Paul much later in Corinth. It is a constant, strategic redeployment of resources in the face of intense, relentless opposition.
It's exhausting just thinking about it. Let's take a step back and look at what we've covered today. We are talking about well over 150 miles of travel on foot or by small boat.
Yeah.
We're talking about surviving violent street mobs, navigating corrupt political extortion and bail bonds, finding a pocket of brilliant, open-minded scholars, and then having to flee again under the threat of violence. All of this just to share a message.
That's a message.
But that message, carried by those battered travelers, really did become the seed of a movement that outlasted the Roman Empire itself. It truly did turn the ancient world upside down.
It's a profoundly impactful historical narrative. And as we conclude today's deep dive, I think it provides a vital mirror for us.
How so?
Well, we live in an era of unprecedented information overload. New ideas, disruptive concepts, and paradigm-shifting news hit us every single day. The question this ancient text forces us to ask is, how are we reacting to the disruption in our own lives?
Right.
Are we behaving like the Thessalonian mob? Are we letting our preconceived biases, our fear of losing our social status, or our tribal loyalties turn us hostile to new information? Are we willing to cancel or shout down an idea simply because it threatens our comfort zone? Or are we willing to do the hard work of objective evaluation?
We all want to think of ourselves as the noble-minded Bereans when we encounter new information. We all want to believe we are the objective
Of
one.
course we do.
But here is something to chew on as you go about the rest of your day. The Bereans had the luxury of a slow, daily evaluation. They sat with the texts. Today, the algorithmic feeds on our phones and the platforms we scroll through are literally engineered by tech companies to trigger that Thessalonian mob reaction.
That is such a good point.
They are designed to bypass the Berean part of our brain entirely and elicit instant outrage and instant sharing. So the next time you feel that sudden surge of anger at a headline, or you feel the urge to immediately jump into an online argument, ask yourself, are you actually taking the time to search the sources and verify if it's true, or are you just letting an algorithm incite a marketplace riot in your mind?